mentioned that you and your newspaper were able to save some 40 men and relocate them to Canada. Could you talk a bit about what the process of that was and how you were able to do that? And first, I just wanted to say thank you so much. You're such an inspiration, and I'm so grateful to have gotten to hear what you did and for everything that you've done for us. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that was very specific situation. Like I said, we couldn't name the victims, and actually we knew a few names. I know the number of the repression, and my sources among the security service in Chechnya or Ministry of Internal Affairs of Chechnya were saying about hundreds of those who were detained and put in the camps because they were gays. We knew some names of people who were killed, but we talked to few victims who survived only before we published first story. And before we published first story, we united with the human rights organization that actually protect LGBT people in Russia. And we opened a hotline for people who live in Caucasus, for LGBT people in Chechnya. I was pretty sure that nobody would write, because it wasn't the phone number, it was like a mail, and people were supposed to write their stories on this mail, and I knew how were frightened people in Chechnya, and I was completely sure that nobody would use this hotline. And I was really surprised when after the first, we published this hotline 3 days before the first story I published. And after the first story, in 2 weeks, we received more than 100 people who applied for the help. And actually the number of those people that were managed to evacuate from Chechnya first to Russia, Moscow, St. Petersburg, other cities. And then there was a huge another story, how we put pressure on the embassies and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of different countries to push them give visa those people because they were not safe in Russia. The only way to save them is to evacuate them to different countries. And Litva and Canada were two countries that stepped forward and say, okay, we're taking those people. And others were behind those countries. They took 1 or 2 people, and some other countries like United States said, we can't help with this, sorry. There were different reactions. Sweden, for example, wrote us that it's internal situation of Russia and they can't help at all. But in general, we managed to save more than 120 people. Yeah. They all now not in Russia. They left Russia on the special conditions because they receiving their not just visa but the asylum very, very fast, and they receive it very quickly. And the governments who took them, they take care of those people. And like I said, I was in Canada, and those people, my guys, they are all happy. Well, at least they're not afraid anymore. Yeah. And I should say that it's the first time in my career where one story saves so many people. I think it's a big result.
Hi, Elena. My name's Bonnie Simons-Brown. I'm an Australian journalist. How can we, as non-Russian journalists, better support your and your colleagues' work?
Well, you know what? Everybody, it's just a big mistake to say that I am the only one who saved all those people, who broke up the story and blah, blah, blah. Because everybody, and a lot of people played a huge role, every one in each time. And all these efforts from different people, from different organizations, when they were put together, they achieved those results. They saved those people. And foreign journalists were playing a huge role in this situation because when, like I said, we had all those victims that called us and connect us, and we evacuate them and bring them, for example, in Moscow and St. Petersburg. They were in the shelters, they were in the flats, and they were in panic, and the psychologists were working with them, trying to put them down. A lot of people were beaten very cruelly. We put them in the doctors. And at the same time, we couldn't write anything about them because, like I said, it's not possible to name those victims publicly. They refused to say their names. They refused to say their stories. And on this point, the story would probably cut down and nothing would come out unless those colleagues from all the world believed, first of all, to Novaya Gazeta, to the reputation of my newspaper, to my reputation, and agreed to follow the security protocol which we created for covering this story. And on this condition, we got agreement of the victims to talk to journalists. And foreign journalists did a huge work to bring this story to the world and get this reaction from the world. And back then in April and May, the situation was so noisy, and the pressure on the Russian government was so big that Russian government first time for 10 years decided to start investigation on those crimes, in judicial killings, extrajudicial killings that happening in Chechnya for all those years. The investigation led to nowhere, but back then it was still a big achievement. So the solidarity also always can be helpful in the story, and I think it's one of the precious things that happened in this story, and a very good lessons that I learned, that solidarity, journalistic solidarity, can move mountains.
You mentioned these golden years when you started and there was free press, or relatively free press. Do you see any signs of hope that that may return to Russia at some point in civil society, maybe in some other news organizations or some groups that could push for that beyond politics? Is there any hope?
Well, you see, I'm an optimist, so I always see a hope at the end of the way. And sometimes I suppose to talk as a journalist who cover every day very tough stories and the very awful human rights violations. But from the point of view, not the journalist, but the person who was born back in Soviet Union and is at age of 40 now in Russia, I can see that the change is still going on in Russia. They are not fast. They are not in the direction that we would like to sometimes. But still the situation is changing, and we probably won't ever have that kind of free media that you used to, or we're used to in America or in the Western world. But we definitely will have something connected with the internet, and people of the next generation, the young people who would probably create different forms of media, and I don't know what kind of forms, and I don't know where we're going. I know that the state still consider, like back in Soviet Union, that the free media is the main threat for them. I hope someday it will change. But it depends not on the government, it depends on the people. Back in 90s, the people didn't fight or didn't consider it as a main value. It was given to them just like that. And they lost it just like that. I hope the new generation of Russian people, they will pressure this value. And as soon as they will get it back. Like I said, I'm optimist. But now the situation in Russia is, if you want to know the truth, you have the sources and you have the opportunity to know it. You have to want to know the truth. That's the only condition.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the internet and sort of the state controls of technology, and how does information circulate online?
Well, last few years, 2 or 3, we're seeing that the state is very eager to control everything in internet. From one side, they want, and they pass the laws that allows to put people in prison for posting something, which is ridiculous, because we have a constitution of Russia that allows, and actually everybody, to have a freedom of opinion and speech. But at the same time, a lot of people in prison, in real prison, I mean, for 1-2 years, because they posted something that the government consider a threat. From the other side, I see that government always behind the technology. For example, we have, probably you've heard, very famous opposition politician Alexei Navalny. And several days ago, the government, using the court decision, forbid and closed on the internet Navalny's site, Navalny Media. Everybody is looking at, watching this media, and going to through the VPN. So although they forbid it officially, everybody has opportunity to use to still get access to this. And we always we notice that the government following the China way to control the internet, but still, it's like I said, maybe if they want and put a lot of I forgot the word even in Russian. Effort. Yes. And close the internet completely or control it. They would do this, but they doing it step by step. But still, it's very open to the people who gets the news from the internet, not from the state media or traditional media.
Thank you so much for sharing your amazing story. My question for you is as a newspaper that often sort of pushes the boundaries on sort of what's possible, I would love to hear you explain a little bit about what the thought process is that you and your fellow colleagues go through when you're deciding whether you're going to pursue the story? Are there lines that you feel, are there red lines that you feel like you couldn't possibly do because it would then, possibly pretend, government crackdown on your work? What's the process like when you're trying to figure out whether to pursue something further?
Of course, we have lights, and I do too, but it's again, I'm talking about very unique newspaper. I don't have answer why we survive and why we on the 1st of April going to celebrate 25th of our anniversary. I just don't have answer why and how it happened. But our boundaries are never like what the government or security service of Russia would think. For example, my editor-in-chief, Dmitry Muratov, when we were watching TV television series, the newsroom, and they were dealing with those fake dossier on I forgot the name of the Guinea. Well, they were trying to for a long time they were trying to get many sources to confirm the information they got from the Secret Service, yes, and finally they published it and they made a mistake. And my editor-in-chief, although the result of this situation was a huge journalistic mistake, my editor-in-chief was watching this TV series and said, they were checking it too long. I would publish it much more faster. This is an example of my editor-in-chief, and if the story is breaking and tough and consider and the interest of very high politicians in Russia, we would definitely publish it. Although we would try to check it. Of course. My alliance is, like Alenka said, it's my sources. I work in a very sensitive region where people definitely would be killed if I do a mistake. So I have to think about it. And sometimes, and in many times, I refuse to publish story because I understand that this is the only source and they will get to know it and cut him and kill him. And I can't take this responsibility on me. I would refuse from any story. And if we have a pressure from the government, we would, it's never a line for us. And we learned how to deal with this for many years. But once we refused to publish a story on Putin's family, because of also lines, but it's not the lines of that we were afraid of the pressure and somebody would close us. We're afraid of this every day, so we got used to this fear. This story was about his daughters and the way how they keep the secrecy of their personalities. It wasn't the story that those daughters steal something or corrupt someone or do something wrong. It was just the story about their names and their passports and how the Secret Service hiding them. We refused to publish the story. We told the guy that it's just a very personal thing, and no matter that those women are president's daughters, we don't want to interfere to this because we don't see the public interest in this story. And this was, I think, the right thing to do. So that kind of lines we have.
Yes. There have been many headlines and many stories about Russia in this country in the last few months, 2 years. And I wonder, I mean, how this story about the Russian election, the Russian interference in the US election has been covered in Russia, and how has it been perceived in Russia, and how the government actually is dealing with that story publicly in Russia.
Well, the problem is that we actually was the newspaper who started to cover the. I'm not really good on this story, but the connection with the hackers that worked on Facebook and their connections to Trump administration, something like that, or I don't know. I'm sorry. We were the one who started to cover this because there was arrests and trials on those hackers in Russia, I guess. But then some other not very famous media continue this story. But it's going not really good because we still we following a little bit by the investigation that America has on those connections, but we still kind of don't understand was the harm so big to talk that much about it, or it's just the attempt of interfering to the American business, internal affairs. But so far, I haven't seen any normal report on this story in Russian media, just pieces to pieces like that. And of course, in official media, doesn't cover in any way. Government media just making jokes on this story.
Thanks a lot.